Okay, I really can't stand in one place. Thanks a lot, Al, for the introduction. And actually, we're going to have more than what we promised because we have 2 years of data. So that's good. Usually we're always behind, but this one we're at least on time. And so this is really a group effort of faculty in the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering as well as the Department of Agronomy. And most importantly, a graduate student, Brian Doherty. Brian, if you can raise your hand. Brian is the grad student working on this and has gotten things really well summarized, and I think that hopefully you'll find this interesting. This is probably one of the more interesting projects I've been able to be involved with because even in the first couple years we're seeing some very interesting results, and sometimes it takes a long time to see anything of interest if we see it at all, but this one we seem to be seeing some things right away. Kind of just an overview of what I'm going to talk about, then I'll turn it over to Dan. And Dan Andersen, Dr. Dan Andersen are in the same department, Ag and Biosystems Engineering. So I'm going to talk a little on why use of manure and cover crops, a little on the research site and the drainage system design for those that may not be familiar. This is a site that has been in place since the late 80s, and we've done a lot of different nutrient management studies up there and a lot of different liquid swine manure studies up there, but the one I'll talk about is a little unique. We'll talk about some of the precipitation and drainage from 2016, crop years 2016-17, drainage water quality, cover crop and uptake and yields. So certainly in an audience like this, you all know the benefits of livestock manure and the benefits they can provide for agricultural producers in Iowa as well as other parts of the country and world. So, less need for purchase fertilizer, add micronutrients, and one of the big things that is getting talked about a lot now is soil health. So, some of our livestock manures can help us with increasing soil organic matter, improving soil porosity and aggregate stability, reducing soil bulk density, and increasing microbial activity and nutrient cycling. Okay, so top 10 or plus 2 reasons to use cover crops, just to kind of start, and Brian put these together, and I had him change the first 2 to gray, just because using cover crops, certainly there are farmers have reported some ability to cut fertilizer use or improve yield potential and profit over time. A lot of that is what I view it as long-term research needs in this area to be able to document this. I think there certainly is some potential in there, and hopefully on a number of our projects we can keep them going long enough to see some of these benefits. But some of the other things, they may be able to help us with manure management as we think about the water quality aspects that we'll talk about here today. In certain areas, maybe not as much for hog producers, but in other areas, I think there's great opportunities for grazing of those cover crops. May help us with reducing compaction with the soil roots that we have. Some work on providing weed control benefits for, following that cover crop, some weed suppression benefits, which could help us with herbicide needs. We've been able to document some increase in infiltration rate. So as we think about reducing runoff, if we can increase infiltration rate, we can move more water into the soil rather than running off. If we build things like soil organic matter, we can help increase water holding capacity, which is positive as we think about resiliency to drought events or dry conditions, more water holding capacity for plant available water. Kind of along with that, building resiliency to the extreme weather, feeding that soil biology. I'd say that's an area where we're still learning about soil biology. Certainly an ag engineer doesn't understand most of that stuff. And we talked about increasing soil organic matter. And then certainly I think one of the things we can definitely see is reducing soil erosion. And so, maybe a top top one, as we think about it, that's the thing we can see out there on the landscape, helping us reduce erosion in a lot of cases. Okay, so our drainage water quality research facility at the Northeast Research Farm, we have 36 1-acre drainage plots. As I mentioned, this site's been in place since the late 80s. Probably as many published drainage water quality studies per acre as any site in the country. Just a little aside, I have to give a little aside once in a while. So there have been a number of reviews of drainage water quality studies from around the country, and it's interesting to see what state has like the most published studies or site years of data on drainage water quality of nutrient management, and it's Iowa. So, we're a leader in a lot of things, including pork production, but we're also a leader in studying the impacts of nutrient management on drainage water quality. Okay, so each of these plots is individually managed and individually drained. So there's a tile line down the center of each plot, and that red rectangle there is our assumed kind of capture drainage area that we capture and monitor. So the plot is the whole kind of blue outline. There's a plot on either border to try to isolate flow from one plot to the next. Then there's a center tile line, and we monitor that center tile line, and we assume the water flow comes from half of that plot area. If you start looking at plot-to-plot variability, you see a lot because, soils are not homogeneous, so there's heterogeneity below ground, and so, that assumption of half the plot area is probably not always accurate. Okay? It's always interesting when you get somebody new, like a new graduate student working on the project, and they're like, the flow is so variable from one plot to the next. It's like, well, soils are variable, right? Okay, sorry. Okay, each of those center tile lines dump into a sump, okay? The kind of picture on the left, the drain tile would come in there. There's a sump pump in there. That water is pumped out. There's an inline flow meter so that we capture and record the volume of flow that's pumped out of that sump. That's the water that's coming from the plot. And then there's an orifice inline, the back pressure in that pipe. The orifice forces water through the orifice and to a sample container. So one of the things in water quality data collection is collecting a sample that's representative of all the water that comes from the plot. And in this case, we collect a small portion of all the water that comes from the plot. Somewhere around 0.1% of all the water that comes out of that drain tile is collected into a sample container. Okay, so these are the management systems for the 2016 through 2018 study period. And we work together with the Iowa pork producers, as well as one on some gypsum with calcium products on that specific treatment, but specifically with the Iowa pork producers to come up with treatments that were hopefully addressing questions they get asked as Pork Producers Association and question that you as pork producers would ask. So we have corn-soybean rotation. The first treatments I'll talk about are corn-soybean rotation. And corn and soybean are present, like a whole plot of corn and a whole plot of soybean in each given year. So we have corn and soybean present every year. So systems 2 and 5 compare an early fall manure application. So in this case, right after the, I should say early fall manure application before corn. So right after the soybeans come off, as quickly as possible, they inject liquid swine manure prior to the corn crop. Okay, and so that will be late September to early October timeframe. And then system 5, we do that, but then come back a few days later and drill in winter cereal rye. So we're looking at early fall manure application with and without a winter cereal rye cover crop. So the question was, if we, for logistical reasons, there are areas where we're applying that liquid swine manure, say closely after soybean harvest, is there a risk of increased nitrate loss, and can we mitigate that with a cover crop? Okay, so then we have the other comparison without cover crop, but a later fall manure application in this case. So we would wait until soils are 50 degrees and cooling to apply the liquid swine manure in that case. So we have a early fall manure versus late fall manure, and then early fall manure with and without cover crops. We also have, because of some previous treatments, there were, well, there's 3A, 3B, 4A, and 4B. We moved to a continuous corn system, but that allowed us to look at a few other questions. So we're able to look at a late fall manure application with and without instinct included in that liquid swine manure. Logistically, this, okay, and then we had late fall manure and then late fall manure plus gypsum application. In the eastern part of the Corn Belt, there's work looking at gypsum as a soil amendment, maybe to help reduce some dissolved P losses. And so we were able to work with calcium products to look at this treatment, because there's been very little work done in the western Corn Belt on this. And then we also have spring. You know, logistically, this one would be a challenge, right? But we have a spring liquid swine manure application versus the late fall manure application in a continuous corn system. Okay, so those are all our treatments. I know I took a long time to go through that, but hopefully kind of talked through it. We also have some information. We have a kind of a control of a spring UAN. The only thing is that one there is tillage with that versus our other corn soybean systems with liquid swine manure being a no-till, other than the injection. So there's not a full width tillage in those. We reduced the confounding of these treatments. If you look at the 08 through 2015, there was all this confounding with tillage and manure application and things, and it was kind of a mess. Dan and I cannot take well, Dan can't take any of the blame. I can only take a little of the blame for that. I'm not taking all the blame, okay? I'll take blame for a lot, but okay. So this graph looks at precipitation and drainage since we started this study. So we started the study pretty much in the fall of 2015, and so the red line there is the monthly precipitation. The blue line is the 30-year average monthly precipitation. And as you look at that, a couple things come to mind. We've had a couple wet years or wet periods at this site, which is actually probably why as we talk about this, why we've seen some of the dramatic differences we have. But you see in the kind of November, December period of 2015, quite a bit wetter than normal from a precipitation standpoint. And then you look at, June, July, August, September of 2016, very wet up at this site. And then 2017 was actually, there was a little wetter in July, but kind of a more normal year. So we've had one really quite wet year in crop year 2016, a little bit more normal in crop year 2017. Okay, so now we're getting to the drainage water quality results. This is the monthly flow-weighted nitrate concentration for the corn soybean treatments. And this is the following through the corn phase. So this would be actually in crop year 16 and crop year 17 different plots, but it's following through just the corn phase of the system. The next graph will show you the soybean phase of the system. Okay? The blue line that we see there is the monthly nitrate concentration where we had that early fall manure application. And so we did see a higher nitrate concentration with that early fall manure application, both in 2016 and 2017. Now, if we compare that to the red line, do we see that red line quite a bit lower? That's the early fall manure with the cover crop. And so when we used that cover crop, we saw dramatically lower nitrate concentrations than where we had not used the cover crop with the same manure timing. Okay, so that's a really, I think, very stark how much reduction we got. Actually, where we had the early fall manure with the cover crop, the nitrate concentrations were pretty similar to that UAN treatment. The green is then the late fall manure application. So we can actually see that early fall manure with cover crop had lower nitrate concentration than even that late fall manure. But we did see with the early fall was higher than that late fall manure application if we compare the blue line versus the green line there. Okay. So this was pretty dramatic for the first couple years. If we look at kind of the load loss, the cumulative nitrate loss over that period, so cumulative nitrate nitrogen loss over that period, you'll see that, over that 2-year period, we lost about 110 pounds per acre from the kind of the early and the late manure application. And this is where we maybe don't see as much difference in the nitrate loss as we do the concentration because of plot-to-plot variability in flow. So I think it's better to actually just focus on the concentrations that we see. But we do see with the red one, the red line there is that we saw lower nitrate loss with the early fall manure and cover crop treatment. If we look at the soybean side of the phase, okay, so there would be, in this no manure application prior to this crop. So we see, less impact of the treatments, at least the ones without the cover crop in the soybean phase. But we do see the red line there is our soybean system with the winter cereal rye cover crop, and we see a lower nitrate concentration where we've used that cover crop. So this is kind of, again, help documenting cover crops, help us with reducing nitrate loss. And here's the cumulative nitrate loss, again, lower with that cover crop treatment. All right, the nitrate concentration where we had the continuous corn system, very little, don't see much with a treatment effect with those different late fall, spring, spring with instinct, or fall with instinct or the fall in gypsum. So in general, at least in the first couple years, not any dramatic differences like we see with the corn soybean in the timing of the manure application. If we look at it close, I guess the spring might be a little bit lower in some periods, kind of in some of the spring months, but then maybe a little bit, on an absolute basis, a little higher later in the summer in 2016. All right, so how much N was taken up by that cover crop? In the spring of 2016, the farm superintendent, Ken Pekanowski, called, actually sent an email, and he said, I'm going to sample the cover crop for biomass. What do you want me to do with sampling out there? Do you want me to sample over the row or over the manure band or adjacent to the manure band? And our Carl Peterson that works with us on campus were like, Ken didn't sound very happy with that, like extra sampling, So we called him. We said, well, ideally, we'd like to get a sample over the manure band and adjacent. He goes, oh, that's no problem. I'll do it. But I think it's interesting because look at in 2016 and 2017, if we sampled that cover crop kind of over that manure band, there was about 100 pounds of N in that above ground biomass. Okay, and then if we look at, before corn between the band, we're down at, 30 to 40 pounds. Okay? So as we think about maybe some of the results we see subsequently, thinking about 100 pounds in that above ground biomass may be critical, and how we might manage this going forward. If we look at before soybeans, we're talking about 40 to 50 pounds in those 2 years in above ground biomass. No, we didn't sample roots in this case. So that one, we're staying away from doing all kinds of root sampling.
Matt, did you see
Yeah.
that video
Yeah, I'm going to show a picture, and the picture doesn't do it justice. But that was the exact reason why Ken said, should we sample over it? He said, it's obvious out there. So yes, it was. Especially in the spring of 16, I think it was more visually apparent than the spring of 17. Okay, so this is what's the injection equipment that's out there. In fact, this is probably, yeah. So it's kind of tough to see, but you can kind of see some of those bands right in there with the greater growth than between the bands. So this was, I guess, August 6th of 2016 at that site. Okay, so this is where it maybe doesn't look quite as good, and this is where, as we think about in the future, we might have to think about managing this, okay? So the gray bar there, this is the corn yields, bushels per acre. So the gray bar is the spring UAN chisel, okay? So a couple things is it is tillage, there is tillage there, and actually if we look at the study period from 08 to 2015, where we had a little bit more direct tillage comparisons, we see a reduction in corn yield with no-till at this site. So I think as we think about the results we see here, there's kind of two things. One is a spring versus a fall application. The other is the gray bar is a chisel or a tillage system versus essentially no-till with the others. Okay, but if we look at, if we compare the early fall manure no-till, early fall manure no-till with cover crop, and then the late fall manure, we in both years we see a pretty dramatic yield. 16 we saw a 26 bushel decrease with the cover crop, but then in 17 we don't see any big decrease. In fact, it's pretty close to the same, okay, with the cover crop in that case. But if we do look at the timing, early fall versus later fall, we see about a 27 bushel increase with the late fall manure in 2016, 64 bushel in 2017. Okay? So that early application is definitely, at least at this site, in those 2 years, again, especially 2016 was a wet fall, crop year 2016, so fall of 2015 was a wet fall, but we see a pretty big difference there. Yes, sir. We have. I don't have that summarized in here, but that's all will be included in the report. So yes, we're taking late season stock nitrate samples as well as profile for end of season soil nitrate. We're taking LSNT period samples as well. So okay, so I think this has been somewhat of a surprise how dramatic we've seen that timing. One of the things as we think about that manure with cover crop treatment, we had 100 pounds in that above ground biomass. And so as we think about toward the future and say crop years 2019 and beyond, could we think about it as far as a systems approach? So right now we have pretty direct comparison. Early fall manure with cover crop. Could we look at it with that cover crop one to maybe use some starter in the spring? So a systems approach on how we can maximize or optimize our crop yield while still getting the water quality benefit. So now we will have 3 years of pretty direct comparison. Now we can go a little bit more confounding maybe and look at a systems analysis. Yes, sir. How big is the cover crop? Actually, if I look at this, is about the size I would say it was, because they probably killed it pretty within a week or so after that, at least in 2016. 8 to 9 inches. Okay. Yep. Okay. So if we look at our soybean yields, we actually 17, we saw very little difference. 16, we saw some decrease with the cover crop in that system. I think we're still learning how to best make sure we get good soybean yields, because this is like one of the anomalies of any of the studies, any of the cover crop sites we've been involved with, that we saw a decrease in soybean yield after cover crop. So our continuous corn yields, if we look at that, so late fall manure and then late fall manure with N inhibitor, I'd say don't look at 2016, because actually that first bar, that corn crop was following soybeans because of previous site history. But in 17, we saw a 12 bushel difference between the late fall manure with the instinct versus just late fall manure. If we look at, this is what's been interesting, is Dan first saw this information. We see in 2016, we saw a 37 bushel yield benefit with that spring liquid swine manure application, and 29 bushel in 2017. Would that cause logistically that may be difficult, right? Okay, but at least it's important, I think, to know at least what we saw during this period from a yield impact. Again, with the continuous corn, we see very little difference in the nitrate between any of those 4 treatments, but we have seen a little bit with the crop yield. Okay, so if we look at 2016, 2017, as I said, it's only 2 years of data, but I think there's some, kind of preliminary assessment we can do. And as I said, 2016 was crop year 2016 was a wetter year than crop year 2017. We do see at least kind of trending positively with the spring versus the fall application. That later fall application was better for both a crop yield as well as a drainage water quality standpoint. We didn't talk about this too much, but this is bringing in a little bit from the previous study as well. We're not seeing really any reduction in nitrate loss with no-till compared to a conventional tillage system from a nitrate standpoint. Certainly all kinds of benefits of no-till, absolutely, but from a nitrate perspective, not much impact. Cover crops helped us reduce nitrate N levels and overall N loss. As we think about it from an overall management standpoint, it is fairly complicated. There are logistical reasons why, things happen out on our landscape, weather, and thinking about, a spring application, again, that could be a very tight window. We could be very worried about compaction, but there could be some yield benefits in certain years. The cover crops take management and the timing issues, and how in the future would we optimize those yields within a cover crop system if we're using it with manure, I think is a really important question, and hopefully we're able to look at that into the future. If we, as I said before, if we use some starter N, can we bump that corn yield where it's following the cover crop and still have the water quality benefit that we want? I think there's probably great potential there, but we need to try to document it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Dan Andersen. And Al, I don't know if you want to introduce Dan while here. Dan and I will. You can go introduce Dan while we switch to lavalier mic. I'd be happy to answer a question or two while Dan gets up. Dan's going to talk a little more on the economics of some of this. Yes, sir.
Have you thought about seeding the cover crop first and then applying the manure late with the stabilizer?
Yeah, that would be a very good aspect to think about how we manage. Yeah, kind of as part of the system, how do we manage it? We did it the way we did as far as injecting and then drilling, because in the fall of 15, we weren't set up to interseed into the standing soybeans to get the cover crop growing and then injecting into it. I think that would absolutely be something to look at in the future, is injecting right into that cover crop I think both of them will still see, if we can get the cover crop growing, we'll still see the water quality benefits. But how do we manage the cover crop so that we don't see, any yield decline on that subsequent corn crop? Yeah.
Was it sow or finisher manure and how many gallons?
Okay, finisher, and do you know? Yeah, I forgot to mention that before. Our nitrogen application rates were, our target was 150 pounds of N per acre for corn following soybean and 200 for corn following corn. Sorry.
And they're assuming 100% availability and no volatilization losses in coming up with the rate.
Okay, I think I'll have you hold on to your questions, and we'll have both of these guys up here when we get done with Dan here. So the next presenter is Dr. Dan Andersen. Dr. Andersen is currently an assistant professor and extension specialist in agriculture and biosystems engineering at Iowa State University. Dr. Andersen received his bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin and received his master's and doctorate at Iowa State. Dr. Andersen grew up on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin where he developed a passion and appreciation for agriculture. His primary interests are in manure management and use for crop production and impacts on soil and water quality. He has played an integral role in Iowa manure applicator training and is current manure foam and other environmental research efforts at ISU. So please welcome Dr. Dan Andersen.
Thanks, Al. A long introduction, but the only thing I'll comment on is when it says University of Wisconsin, I'm not a Badger, right? That's a common misconception. I actually went to Platteville, so just across the river from Iowa. So as Matt mentioned, Matt went through a lot of data. I'm going to try and be a little bit broader and just talk about manure economics, some of our manure system approaches and things like that. And I named my talk An Ancient Fertilizer in a Precision Age. I think, manure sometimes gets a bad rap. But we found a lot of sophisticated ways to manage it. You guys have implemented a lot of sophisticated ways to manage it, and I think it's important for us to talk about it as that type of precision fertilizer. Whenever I talk about manure, I like to start with really how much manure is there, and I think we all know that we make about 1 gallon of manure per pig per day. You start adding that up over the state of Iowa, and it's going to sound like a lot of manure, right? We might have 10 billion gallons of liquid manure that we handle annually. So a nice big number. But we know it's a fertilizer. So I like to compare it to crop nutrient utilization in any specific county. So what you're looking at here is I have a scale on the bottom, anywhere from 0 to just a little over 100%. And that would be the percent of nitrogen, in this case, that could be supplied from animal manures in that county for the crops in that county. And a couple words of caution on what I came up with for estimating nutrient need in that county. It's based entirely on removal. So when I look at corn, it's 0.8 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn. If you think about your manure management plan, you can put on 1.2 for most of Iowa, 0.9 everywhere in Iowa. So that's a very conservative estimate, right? So I'm estimating a very low nutrient need capacity. Certainly it's really higher than that. And then I said soybeans can make all their own nitrogen. And that's not true, right? Soybeans only can fix a portion of their nitrogen. The rest they have to get from the soil. So very conservative estimate. The point being, when you look at the state of Iowa, large need for manure, right? There's very few counties where we're even close to getting 80, 90% of all our nutrients from manure. A little fact for you, Iowa's never been more manure poor than it is today. That is, we've never gotten a lower percentage of our crop nutrients from manures. So we're more reliant on other forms of nitrogen, whether that be UAN or anhydrous ammonia than ever before. So when you hear stories about water quality and it's related to having more manure, another way to draw that regression line would be to compare it to the percentage of nutrients that come from manure, and it will look the exact opposite, right? It would say more manure would be better for water quality. A little bit on what finishing manure is worth. I'm not going to dive into gestation farrowing manure or nursery manure. Certainly when we look at deep pit finishing manure, it tends to have the highest nutrient value. Other manures are a little bit lower than that. What I get for a typical nutrient concentration, when I look at all your test results from around the state that I get coming into me, we're somewhere around 60, 25, 30 pounds of nitrogen, P2O5, and potash per 1,000 gallons. That's pretty average. I won't say that's what it is, right? If you give me a call or a question, I'll tell you there's lots of variability to that. I might see anywhere from 40 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, all the way up to the highest test I've seen is 98 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. right? So that's a pretty hot manure when you see 98 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, but they're out there. If you look at what current fertilizer prices are, we're hanging out about $36 per 1,000 gallons worth of nutrient value. I'm not telling you can sell that manure for that price, but that fertilizer value is there. I wanted to look back at a little bit of what we've seen in the last 15, 20 years here for the nutrient value in manure. The good news is we've tended to trend up, right? So this takes into account both what our typical average concentrations were for that deep pit finishing manure in any given year, as well as what fertilizer prices are. If you think back to somewhere in that 2010, 2012 area, you might remember some pretty high fertilizer prices. That's mostly what's driving those really high bubbles there. I think we're all happy that those came down. But we've stabilized pretty recently, and we still hang out in that $30 to $40 sort of window on average, so pretty high value. My question to you is, what are we doing to capture all that value? And certainly when we think about manure and some of the logistical challenge that we had, especially as Matt mentioned with timing, there's lots of issues that go into that. And things like getting it to the right field at the right time in the right place, making sure we're using the right application methods, all are critical. We can also look at practices like cover crops and what we're doing to minimize N loss for improving water quality. So there's lots of things going on. And the struggle tends to be that every year is quite a bit different, right? When we think about the Nashua study over just those 2 years, Matt pointed out that 1 year was really wet. 1 year was about what he called average. I looked at that same weather data, and my father-in-law has a cow-calf in northeast Iowa. And although the rainfall is average for that year, he would tell me that there's no way it was average, right? He recalled a rainfall of 7 inches at his farm and then another one of 9. Well, it was average, over the whole month, but some really large rainfall events in there. And I think that might play a little bit of a role in what he saw for 2017 data there for water quality. So my question to you is, how do we collect that nutrient value? And what I wanted you to think about is, what percentage or where does that value come from? Is it the nitrogen, or is it the other nutrients as well? And certainly I'm not saying we have to move all our manure to fields where we really need that phosphorus and potassium. That can lead to some pretty far hauling distances. But if you look at the typical manures in Iowa, and we only value that nitrogen, we tend to have to stay pretty close to our farm in order to make it a cost-effective fertilizer, right? We're generally talking 1, maybe when we move to some solid manures, 2 miles away. So we don't have much transport distance. But if you can find fields where we have need for that phosphorus and potassium, where we'll see that crop response, there's some pretty large windows that open up there, right? If we look at the phosphorus and potassium value, and we're including that in our nitrogen value, we can start thinking about hauling swine manure from a finisher 5 miles away. Is that a long ways in Iowa? Absolutely. I don't think we have to take most of our manure anywhere near that far. But when you think about what the economics would say and what we could charge for transport additional miles away from the farm, it would work out that we could afford to do it. So I think there's some opportunities there to really look for fields where we need that phosphorus, need that potassium. A word of caution, if you have those situations, probably don't move all your manure that far away. I do want you to finish in that window we have available in the fall, right? And if you would have to start in September to get all your manure hauled that 5 miles away, probably not good from a nitrogen management perspective, right? So it is a balancing act. Just some economics on what I'm told people charge for hauling swine finishing manure. The rough rate, if I look at all the custom applicators and what they tell me they're charging, it's about 2 cents per gallon, depending on the rate that you're putting on. But for typical swine finisher manure, somewhere in that 2,500 to 4,000 gallons an acre, we're roughly in that range of 1.50 to 2 cents a gallon. And they suggest that their incremental charge is about 1/10 of a penny per mile per gallon. With that incremental charge for how far they're hauling, all over the board. If you're in northeast Iowa and they have to take curvy roads to get to your field, tends to be a little bit higher, right, per that gallon that we want to move an extra mile. If we're in central Iowa using a drag hose, sometimes we can see that number get a little bit less. My question to you is, if you think about the value of manure, and I said it was worth $36 per 1,000 gallons, about $14 of that is from nitrogen right now. That means it's about $20 to apply that 1,000 gallons of manure. So we have $16 worth of value that we're playing with. How far can you really think about moving that manure and still having it be more cost effective than commercial fertilizer? So there's some flexibility there, an opportunity to take advantage of that. A question I've been getting the last couple years with swine finisher manure is, are our phosphorus values getting too low? And if you look at what's happened in manure, we've done lots of things, right? We've seen wet-dry feeders installed in almost every barn. That brought down manure production values. It brought up nutrient concentrations. Didn't really change the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. But we started feeding pigs a lot differently, right? Phytase is at higher levels than ever before. We've tended to have more distillers in our rations at times when it's cost effective. And the nitrogen-phosphorus ratio in manures have really changed. Depending on what rotation you're looking at, whether it be continuous corn or corn-soybean, we might want a ratio of somewhere between 3 to 2, 3 pounds of nitrogen to 2 pounds of P2O5, or 4 to 1. If you look at our average swine finishing manure today, we're roughly in that 3 to 2 ratio. It's not uncommon for me to see a test somewhere at 50 to 15. I would call that a low phosphorus manure. If we have that type of manure, if we're in a corn-soybean rotation, we're phosphorus deficient, right? I'm not telling you to go out and supplement phosphorus. I think most of the time, if you look at the soil test results, for 50, 60 years, we'd struggled with really high phosphorus in our manure, and that's why we had the phosphorus index in Iowa. We were concerned about water quality. This is a chance for us to bring down some of those levels. Certainly, if you're in a continuous corn rotation, we're still phosphorus excess in general, but we won't build up rates very fast, and if you're in really high-yielding situations, we might not at all. Wanted to shine some good news on manure, right? Antonio Mallarino did a nice study a few years ago now on how different runoff event timings after manure application, different fertilizer sources, impacted what our phosphorus losses were. And I think this is a good story for us to tell with manure. When you look at what the results said, if he was surface applying all these manures, not always a common practice, right? We inject, so we're even better than this. But if we were surface applying all the manure, every manure source was much lower than that commercial fertilizer in terms of phosphorus runoff from a rainfall event shortly after application. So when you look at the nutrient reduction strategy for phosphorus, it calls out manure as a good fertilizer source because we're lowering our nutrient losses as compared to synthetic fertilizers. A couple other comments on this data. That first rainfall event is really the most critical when we talk about phosphorus management for manure. So looking for times when we're not going to have a larger rainfall event that induces runoff, where we're going to get that event where we're going to get flush, critical for water quality. If we can't do that, make sure we're getting our manure injected or incorporated. I know we're swine guys. We almost all inject. I bring that up because when you look at a dragline system, do we tend to get quite a bit of surface application on the edges because we have to pick up? Where's the closest route for phosphorus to get into that ditch and leave us? Right from the edge of that field. Right? So that's an area where if we know there's a rainfall event, it's probably pretty important for us to go back, get that incorporated, get it worked in. As Matt alluded to, nitrogen management with manure is complex. He presented a lot of really good data to us, and certainly he'd recognize as well as I do there's no one right answer. There's lots of things going on, whether it be logistics, compaction, or trying to manage for optimum nitrogen. So there's lots of things going on. I'm not going to give you the right answer today. There isn't one right answer, but we are going to try and look at some general concepts. So the first one I wanted to talk about is rate. And certainly in Iowa, there's sort of two rates that are generally recommended, right? If you fill out your manure management plan, it's going to walk you through the paperwork to do a yield goal method. I'm actually a big fan of filling out all manure management plans, the yield goal method. Unless you live maybe in south central Iowa, then I'd tell you yield goal, because yield goal tends to be higher there. So I think it's good to fill out that plan so that you have that cushion. But ISU has switched to MRTN recommendations. When we think about using MRTN for manure, lots of words of caution. One, MRTN is all based on either very late fall fertilizer application or spring application. May not be the case with manure. And it's also always based off commercial fertilizer application. It's not a manure tool, right? So if we're going to try and use that number for manure, we have to think carefully about how to adjust it. That's not to say it isn't a good starting point. For your fields, your farm, I recommend knowing what both those rates are, what MRTN is and what the yield goal method tells you. So if you look at MRTN, if you go to an ISU website, just Google MRTN Iowa State, this website will pop up. It allows you to put in a nitrogen price as well as what you expect corn yield to be. For this one, you can see that I have my nitrogen price at about 30 cents, 29 cents per pound. That's what it's selling at for anhydrous ammonia. And I was pretty optimistic and said 350 corn. We'll see what it really works out to. And it says we should be about 145. If you don't always want to run the tool, it almost always works out to the 150 pounds for corn following soybeans, 200 pounds for corn following corn. Think about that value, compare it to your yield goal method, and sort of figure that you should be somewhere in between the two, right? So how close are they? Where should we really be working at? The economics on injection. There's a reason we all do it, right? It's great for odor control. From a nitrogen management perspective, it will almost always pay for itself as well. I'm not going to beat this horse to death. You're all doing it. The one thing I wanted to comment on is injection quality does matter, right? So just because we have a piece of equipment that says it's injection or immediate incorporation doesn't mean we're actually achieving that. This is a field where it looks pretty good, right? Lots of residue on there. Looks like my injector's got it worked in. I don't see any manure on the surface. We're in good shape. This guy, right, we did the same injectors. It's actually the same field on the same day. I wanted to show you what variability could be. This is the end rows where we deal with lots of compaction, right? Those injectors just couldn't get enough capacity in that soil. It was too compacted to get that manure worked in. So looking behind you, knowing what's going on, adjusting accordingly is important. When you look at the ISU recommendations, it's going to say we lose 0 to 2% of our nitrogen to volatilization if we're injecting. If we run into a situation like that, it's quite a bit higher. If it looks like this, it's probably really close to 0. Matt didn't show this graph, even though he often does for cover crops, so I'm in good shape here. Certainly we recognize that there's a challenge of matching when our nitrogen becomes available with when our crop needs it. Certainly that's one of the advantages of cover crops. We can try and take some of that up and get later release. When we think about manure and adding that to the soil, this gets more complicated, right? That manure is an organic ammonia nitrogen source, and it's going to become plant available at some point. And one of the things we have to do is try and guess when it will be available. With swine manures, it's very easily mineralizable. It's almost all immediately available when we put it into soil. So as Matt showed you, there was a big difference in yield at that site when he did early fall, which I'm going to call October 1st roughly, and late fall manure. If you would take soil temperature data and say November 1st, somewhere in here, I'd get a relative risk of what I would say 0.75, right? It's just a number. Don't worry about what it is. But I want you to compare that to the October 1st data, about 1.5. So by being that early, we've almost doubled our risk of nitrogen loss compared to that 0.75, right? That's a pretty big deal. That's why timing is such an important push. Certainly, year-to-year variability in how soil temperatures go with the weather. Sites in Iowa, across the state, right, north to south, big differences. But that's a general trend that we see. If you look closely, you can sort of see a change in the curve of that graph. Right, if you look at when our soil temperatures are going to hit that 50 and cooling, that's right about in there. That's about why that recommendation exists, right? Because we see that big change in how quickly risk is changing. I'm going to supplement Matt's early and late crop yield data with a study from John Sawyer a few years earlier in Ames. He did have anhydrous ammonia in this manure and liquid soy manure. His anhydrous ammonia almost always out-yielded liquid soy manure in this study. I wouldn't look too carefully at that data. There's about the same number of studies that are going to show the exact opposite effect, that manure is always higher than anhydrous ammonia. But what I did want to point out is the early manure compared to the late manure yield difference, right? We got about 10 bushels an acre more with late manure application, late fall, November 1st, compared to that October 1st. Was that as big a difference as what Matt saw at Nashua? No, nowhere close, right? But it's still a noticeable difference. It was statistically significant. What does that mean for you? I'm going to try and put a few numbers to this. I was low on Matt's yield difference. I think the 2 years he's done at Nashua are about the biggest difference we're ever going to see. So I'm trying to move those numbers down just a little bit. Ames is about 10 if I average those together. October 1st versus November 1st, we're talking about 20 bushels an acre. If I just figure 20 bushels an acre at $3 corn, that's $60 an acre. What does manure application cost roughly per acre? Anyone want to? $60, right? So that's the price of my manure application, right? That 1 month timing essentially it would pay for that manure application. And I think there's a few ways to think about that. If you're early on a list for a custom manure applicator, do we want to say no? Probably not, right? We might not make it on the list before the soil freezes. What does that mean, though, for your ability to purchase equipment? If we can make $60 per acre, can we justify it? Can we make it pay? Depends, right? Alternatively, if you're a commercial manure applicator, should we be charging less or more to try and move in season? And that might be a controversial answer, right? I think they should try and charge more when we move in season. Probably not all of your profit, right? I want you to get half of that, so $30. They charge a little bit more, and they invest in new equipment so that they can get everyone more in season, right? But I think that data is really strong. We have the Ames data that says that yield impact's there. We have some Nashua data that says it's very strongly there. And we know that that's worth about what the cost of manure application is. So I think we have to consider that carefully when we pick our management strategies. Now, is everyone going to be in that window? Certainly not. Don't expect it. Right? We have a lot of logistical challenges. But think about how that may impact your operations bottom line. Just some broadness to cover crop to supplement what Matt did. We know cover crop's good for water quality, and there's a lot of particulars we can talk about, whether it be planting the cover crop early with the high boy, coming back and injecting into it, or what we did at Nashua where we put the manure on and then drilled the cover crop on. And I'll often get questions about what's the right answer. I think it's yes, right? Do what works for you and your system and what equipment you have. Certainly from when we get down to the nitty-gritty, is one maybe a little better for water quality than the other? Maybe. But when you compare it to not having a cover crop on, there is a huge difference. Some places to focus on. Some may apply more or less to these in your operations. Certainly if we have crops that are coming out early, whether that be corn silage or seed corn, right? Those are definitely areas we want to focus on. When we think about soils on our farm, do we have soils that are maybe organic matter poor or more erosion prone than other soils? Right? Those are the ones where if we're going to put one field into cover crops, those are the ones we want to select. Cover crop type. Almost all our research is almost always with cereal rye. Can you use other crops? Certainly. I think there's some advantages to starting out with cover crops that there's a lot of community experience with, though, right? So when someone asks me what they should pick, I tend to suggest cereal rye. I know if you move up to northeast Iowa, south of western Wisconsin, they'll often tell you barley or oats as a starter cover crop, right? They winter kill themselves, so we don't have to worry about it as much in the spring. Do we get as much benefit from that type of cover crop? Probably not. We like that spring growth, but an easy entrance point, right? Something where it's easier for us to manage. From my perspective, when you choose how to seed a cover crop, pick something that works in your system. I grew up on a small dairy farm. We had a grain drill. We didn't call them cover crops. We called them crops, right? We harvested them for forage. But I think that's an easy entry point if you have it. If you don't, what technologies are available in your area to work with? So there's drilling after cover crops after rye removal. If you like a beautiful looking cover crop stand where it's in nice rows, nice and uniform, right? So drilling in is really nice that way. If we fly it on, we might be a little bit more variable in what that cover crop looks like. If we are using this as a nutrient reduction strategy, how it looks, probably less important. If we were going to try and harvest this, probably a little bit more important. But does earlier seeding make up for it in growth? Potentially. Manure injection equipment mixed with cover crops. I certainly think as we move forward, one of the things we're going to look at is early seeding of cover crops and manure injection into it, especially when we think about what that timing impact showed us. There is a lot of equipment out there to choose from on how to get manure injected. And which equipment you choose can have a pretty drastic impact on how that manure, how that cover crop looks after we're done. This would be a typical disc covering unit. This would be more of a vertical till, minimum tillage sort of manure injection into cover crops. Pretty big difference. This one often we'll think about 30 to 40% disturbance of the cover crop. This one might be more in line of 5 to 10% disturbance to the cover crop. It matters what it looks like that fall. My experience has almost always been by the time you get to next spring, it's really hard to tell. Unless the field was very wet and we tore the heck out of it while we were putting it on. Otherwise, in most cases, they respond and look about the same by spring. You won't even know you went through it with the manure applicator. Look for early, easy opportunities to integrate it into your systems. Start small, but definitely we saw from Matt's data that manure is a sensitive fertilizer to timing of nitrogen application, and cover crops really can help mitigate some of those losses. A little bit on manure application equipment. I think we're at a point where almost all of us are using some sort of rate control on our equipment now. I think that's helped us hit rate in most cases. Some of our low rates still tend to be a little bit of a challenge. When you think about 90 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, if we're only putting 2,000 gallons on, that's a pretty low rate. It can be hard to hit with a dragline system. Even with some tanks, it can be a little bit hard to hit. But what I'm going to talk about is the uniformity across our toolbar. So how much does row 1 vary from row 4, from row 8? right? When you think about the equipment and how we were trying to get uniform flow, we're trying to keep our manifold, that splitter up top, pressurized. When it was designed for somewhere in 4,000 to 6,000 gallons per acre applications. We're substantially less than that, right? We're half to a third. So we don't always have as much pressure up there as we were sort of hoping when we designed it, and that's led to some challenges. Here's an example of one where we were testing, and you can see a pretty wide range of what's coming out of every nozzle, right? I don't think this is something that we haven't seen before. If you lift up your toolbar, you can see some variation just like this. Sometimes it's inherent to the equipment. Sometimes it's inherent because of the maintenance we should have done to the equipment but didn't get done. And sometimes it's because we just got a pig bone stuck in the distributor and it was out of our control. I wanted to focus on what it meant for you, right? If we think about what that rate controller is doing, we're going to hit our average application rate that we were trying for. So maybe we were trying for 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, but the amount of variation we have on that piece of equipment can be substantially different, right? And I picked two numbers up here, 35%. That's what a pretty decent, a medium sort of range would be for a piece of equipment. 10% coefficient of variation, that's about what you'd hit with an anhydrous application, right? So that's a pretty good goal to strive for. If you use rough yield curves for averages for the state, turns out that 35% variation compared to 10 in a corn-soybean rotation, worth about 2 bushels per acre. If it's continuous corn, about 4 bushels per acre on average. Certainly, I've seen fields where in the spring, you'd think it looks much worse than that, right? It can look really streaky. It generally grows out of it, and that's why those numbers are so small. But we don't have any actual data on that, right? It's based on what we think is sitting there for nitrogen. Skipping ahead a little bit, we tested quite a few pieces of equipment, quite a few different brands, and then some setup on each of those brands. We had a setup like this, just putting water, in our case, in 55-gallon drums. At one site, we did use silage effluent, so don't worry, I did get a little dirty doing this, but it wasn't with real manure. What we do is set that up to try and hit various application rates, pretending we were driving at 15 miles an hour with 30-inch knife spacing. Fill those barrels for 15 seconds, collect the water in the barrel, measure how much was there, see how much they varied. And then we did this at 3 different slope settings, flat, 3 and 6% to see if it mattered. Someone from Carroll made a great point to me that we should have been steeper. 6% is pretty steep when you're doing these tests. I would tell you we didn't see a huge effect of slope anyway, so we're in good shape. If your toolbar is so wide and your slope so tall that your toolbar, one end of it, gets above your distributor, my results here are going to be garbage. Your flow is going to be very different. So keep that in mind. So he was right. For his case, he said one end of his toolbar was above the distributor. What does that matter? It'll matter a lot. We just didn't get that extreme. This is an older style distributor. It has holes, outlets on the hemisphere, so half the circle. There's plates inside that you're supposed to adjust. Depending on your flow rate, they're a pain in the ass to adjust. I don't think it adjusted a whole lot. Our experience, we did take this apart and adjust them a lot while we did these tests. Even though they say to adjust them, we didn't get a whole lot of performance difference with them. If we're at low rates, we could improve it a little bit. If we're at high rates, we had to open it up, or that spreader was really struggling to push all the flow through. But if I was a farmer, I wouldn't adjust them either. So if you look at where we were for variation, this would be pretty typical of what we saw in most of these. If we were trying to apply at a higher rate, our variability was lower than if we tried to apply at a lower rate. You're going to look at 1,000 gallons per minute and say, well, it got better. It's like an old man peeing at some of these rates, right? The trickles sometimes, I know, right? The trickles coming out of these aren't always maybe representative of how it's actually performing. This is an older style manifold. The company that used this one did recently switch to a newer style that we didn't get tested quite yet. This would be a different style, one that you see pretty common on lots of pieces of equipment now. Outlets, again, on the outside of a circle. But in this case, the manifold's substantially smaller, and there's rotating knives inside there. Those rotating knives are supposed to help clean up any bones that we might have plugging our outlets, but they also occasionally block certain outlets, right? So they're blocking some of those, helping keep it pressurized. If you watch it, what happens then, we sometimes get some shaking on our outlet hoses. That's because the manure is pulsing through it. From a use perspective, when you look at what's coming into the field, it'll still be generally pretty consistent. From a wear on your hose perspective, that pulsing can sometimes wear away, abrade holes in our hose, so something to watch out for. That style of manifold, though, when you think about 10%, We almost always hit that with that style of manifold. We were generally between 8 and 12, maybe 15% variation. All those performed really well, probably because you're keeping pressure in there. They have to be symmetrical for that to work, right? One company didn't need so many outlets for a certain tank, so they only put the outlets on half of their manifold. If you think about what that blocking needs to do, we need symmetry on when outlets are blocked. In this type of situation, we don't get that. We might be blocking 2 outlets, but the middle ones are always open, right? So when the middle one's blocked, only 1 outlet will be blocked. That doesn't split flow evenly, so a little bit of design issue there. When we were really higher rates, there was enough pressure in there that didn't matter. When we dropped to some lower application rates, we lost that pressure, and all of a sudden it becomes a bigger deal. We tested the Houle tanker twice and learned a lot about it. The first time we were out there, they gave us a brand new tank, right, and said, here you go, good luck. We didn't have a toolbar on it yet, so all these hoses dropped straight down into our barrel. Beautiful setup, made my life testing this super easy, right? The easiest one we did. And it worked magnificently. We got back, looked at our data, and said, wow, why was that one so much better than the other ones? Everyone else so far had given us a used tank, something that had been out in the field, something that they didn't set up specifically for this, right? A little tougher to test. But we decided that maybe wasn't a fair comparison. What would it be like in the real world? We came back. This would be my good data from the test. But the first time we were there, we got absolutely terrible results. We spent 2 hours getting every one of our air intakes off the top of those. They're air check valves, right? Every single one of them was plugged with solids. And when those are plugged with solids, you will get siphons in some of your lines. So you don't get even flow splitting. Obviously, they didn't like those results. So the first thing we did, take them all apart, put new air inlets on every single one of those. Then our performance got better. You can see in this case we were about 10%. Not as good as we were the first time, right? In addition to that, this time we had that toolbar on there. So occasionally we get some loops in our hoses. And those loops do matter, right? And I've gotten questions since then about, would you rather all my hoses be the same length, or is it okay or should I have no loops in my hoses, right? Because the middle ones would have to be shorter to do that. And the answer is you want to minimize hose loops more than you want to make your outlet lines the same. All right, just some talking points from that. Probably do think carefully about really high viscosity manures. I don't think so much for finishing manure, that's an issue, although I've seen some finishing manures that are pretty thick, 12, 10% solids. I tend to think that if we're at 6, maybe 7% solids, our results are pretty good. If you get thicker than that, flow might be a little bit different. And though we did see some differences in manifolds, what I want to point out is the maintenance strategies to make every manifold that you have a little bit better. We just talked about those hose loops and really try to minimize them. That was one of the things that when we were doing the testing really could make a difference, and it was easy for us to control. If there's air vents on that spreader, and there certainly should be, whether it's one air vent to handle the whole manifold or one on each line, that has to be working in order to get the manifold to operate as designed. So that was really critical to us, and I'll tell you the truth. Every piece of equipment that we tested that had ever been used, it was plugged, it didn't work well, we took it apart, cleaned it out as best we could, and it functioned better. The other thing that we can do is try and put manure on as fast as we can. And by that I mean if we were driving at 4 miles an hour, if we can increase our drive speed to 5, 6 miles an hour, that's the same as applying at a faster rate. What the manifold really looks at is the gallons per minute flowing through it. So the faster we can drive and still achieve good manure injection, right? Because it's a balance. We have to get that manure covered in the field so it won't volatilize to take advantage of the fertilizer. But the faster we can go and still get it injected well, the easier it will be for our manifold to split that flow. All right, and now I think we're ready for some questions.
Okay, you can ask questions either Matt or Dan or both. Any questions? Right over here.
On the cover crops, was that just the cover crop after soybeans or the corn-soybean rotation, or was it after both crops?
After both crops. Yep, both phases had the winter cereal rye. Yep.
Those breather tubes that are on the top of the outlet, how quickly after you clean them will they plug?
Great question. So the question was, how quickly will the breather tubes or the check valves plug again after you clean them? If you don't get a bone stuck in them, If you get a bone stuck in them, it happens quickly, but if you don't, they generally get plugged over time of wetting them each time we turn the spreader on and then it drying. So I think it would be more like an everyday sort of event where you have to make sure that that check valve is still open in the morning. It's when you build up enough solids that they can no longer move that it gets to be an issue, right? I would tell you that every year we probably should be taking them off and replacing them. Whether we really want to do that, I'm not so sure. I don't know if you've ever seen the hools where they basically take them off, put hoses, and route them back inside the hopper. That would be one way to take advantage of that. And I would think other companies are starting to look at that so that we have less check valve maintenance now. But that is one thing I've seen on the tanks before, where they'll actually get rid of the check valve altogether, just route hoses back into the hopper and recatch it, and that sort of solves the plugging problem.
What was the speed you were talking about on when you pull the tank? What's the optimum speed?
Well, I don't think there is one optimum speed. That's sort of the challenge, right? When we talk about distribution of flow, the faster we can go, the better. Of course, there's real cutoffs to that. And I think you have to focus at some point how good of a job you're doing injecting, how much horsepower your tractor has, and how fast can we really go. I think it's hard to get above 7.5, 8 miles an hour, right? That takes a pretty good tractor to do that. And at some of those speeds, when you look at what's happening with the injector, where we're trying to throw soil back on top of our injection trench, we're missing, right? So I don't think there's one optimal speed. But from a distribution of flow standpoint, if we can push towards 7, we're better off. It's easy on our equipment. Of course, if we have low testing manure, we're already putting on 4,000 gallons an acre, less important, right? It's really when we get into those ranges where we're trying to hit those lower rates, 2,000, 3,000 gallons a minute, where I think we have to try and push those speeds. With that said, I still think coverage of your manure injection is as important as that. So I'd focus more on setting it up to get good injection and using that as a secondary point. If we can drive faster and still get good injection, that's where we would want to be.
I have one question. This is, I guess, for Matt. So we've seen the yield data, and we know we have to increase the yields to get these guys to implement the cover crops.
Yep.
And I've been planting cover crops and doing the weed and feed to get that corn started. What's the plans with research to use starter or weed and feed program, something like that?
So certainly at the Nashua site, that would be where I think we'd want to go in 2019, is change that system to look at more of a system effect of, can we enhance that corn yield with some starter nitrogen application. I would say there's more and more discussion on some, not necessarily water quality related research, but some, on-farm related research on integrating cover crops with manure application. And so I think that we can look at the water quality aspects at Nashua, but there's probably some opportunities. And I think that some folks had some discussions yesterday morning on some of that as well. So I think that I know there's a lot of interest in that. So hopefully there can be some research put together to address this yield question or issue. The question was about drilling the cover crop up there after corn harvest. So for that, before soybeans, after corn harvest, do we get much growth in the fall? No, not a lot of growth in the fall, but then we do have a greater window of growth that following spring before soybeans. I do think that, to optimize the growth in a lot of these areas, interseeding, that cover crop may be beneficial. Certainly, not at Nashua, but at our drainage site at Gilmore City. This is where we're using commercial fertilizer, so we don't have the same treatments. But from about 2004 until 2015, we drilled in after harvest of corn or beans. So it was mid-October. And we still saw some water quality benefit, but that cover crop in the fall was very small. It was like a couple inches. In the fall of 15, we went in and hand seeded, in this case, interseeded in right about Labor Day. And we've seen much more fall growth and actually kind of overall better biomass production when we've done that. So I do think as we get up north in some of those areas, I think that interseeding has some real benefits for sure.
Matt, could you share a little bit about the depth of the roots? We talk about a 8 to 10 inch crop above ground. What are the roots doing underground?
I'm going to ask Sarah Carlson is with Practical Farmers of Iowa and knows as much about cover crops as anybody. Probably has it on the top of her head what the research has shown on the depth of root for cover crops.
Yeah, so like by Thanksgiving, if it was drilled post-harvest, by Thanksgiving it can be like a yard or so deep, and then it's about that depth.
So maybe up several feet deep.
Obviously, moisture content of the soil drives that a lot.
Yeah, I'll have to admit my group has not done a lot with measuring root growth, just because of the challenge of how much work it takes to wash the roots and such.
I think the big takeaway, and I think everybody heard that about 36 inches deep. The big takeaway is there's a lot more going on underground than above ground.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Even in those cases where there's very little above ground, I think we're getting that root growth below ground. Yep.
One more thing, maybe I can ask you to share. When is most of the nitrates lost through tile lines?
That's a really good question. In fact, we're so the April, May, and June. So if we look at our long-term record at Gilmore City, where we've been monitoring for 27 years. A paper that we had out that actually looked at 21 years of data from 1990 to 2011, 22 years of data. About 70% of the drainage and 70% of the nitrate loss came in April, May, and June. So now, the last 4 to 5 years, we've had a little bit more fall drainage than we did in the 90s, but I still think that April, May, and June period is our primary flow and drainage period. We're actually in the process of putting together a paper that looks at drainage sites from Minnesota all the way to Ohio to kind of compare and contrast when we see drainage and nitrate loss, because it's different in the eastern part of the Corn Belt. They get in Ohio and areas of Indiana, they get about 50% of the drainage in the winter months. So kind of in the fallow period where, we're generally pretty froze up during that period.
Just to give you a little background, in 2013, the Iowa Pork Board met with EPA, and EPA wanted our approval to allow them to regulate pig farms in Iowa. And we supported the voluntary nutrient reduction strategy, which they eventually agreed to. And we told them at the time, this is a process. We have to learn and figure out how the best way to do it. And that's, as you can see today, it's a process, and we don't have all the answers yet, so stay tuned, I guess would be the best takeaway.
The question was, have we looked at taking the cover crop to harvest? Not in any water quality work I've done. There are some producers that have done that. I probably as part of Practical Farmers of Iowa trials, and I know Mark Licht is even looking at a small grain, kind of a relay cropping coming after harvest with soybeans, or interseeding the soybeans into some of the standing small grain. But we've not looked at it to date with any of our water quality related research, at least on our drainage water quality plots.
Okay, let's give Dan and Matt a round of applause. Thank you.